Chapter 3, Part 2, the cerebellum. So remember, the cerebellum is that little separate brain-looking portion of the brain. It's attached to the brainstem, posterior or behind the pons. The cortex of the cerebellum is folded in ridges, and they call that folia. And then the white matter of the cerebellum resembles a tree, like branching, and that is referred to as arbor vitae. The cerebellar cortex contains more neurons than the entire cerebral cortex. The types of neurons include stellate, basket, granule, Golgi, and Purkinje cells. So Purkinje cells are the largest cells in the central nervous system. They receive 200,000 synapses and are inhibitory. The cerebellum communicates with other central nervous system regions through 3 large tracts called the cerebellar peduncles. Peduncles, like peduncles, sorry, like an uncle. Functions of the cerebellum include control of muscle movement and tone, balance, regulating the extent of intentional movement, and the cerebellum is also involved in learning motor skills. So make sure that you add that to your little chart if you made one, or the table if you're filling out a table of functions of the different parts of the brain. So again, that cerebellum is kind of branched off right behind the pons. Here's the pons. I call the pons like a little belly sticking off the brainstem, and behind that is the cerebellum. This is cut in half, by the way. All right, moving on to the diencephalon. This is located between the brainstem and the cerebrum. So usually when I refer to the diencephalon, I don't talk about all the different parts, but since this is mentioned here, we'll just kind of mention them. So the parts of the diencephalon are the thalamus, the subthalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. Usually I really only talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and I usually briefly mention the epi. But here we are. So the thalamus is the 2 lateral portions connected by the interthalamic adhesion. The thalamus is surrounded by the 3rd ventricle. Sensory information from the spinal cord synapses here before projecting to the cerebrum. So we have auditory information coming through, visual information coming through, and other sensory information, all kind of synapsing at the thalamus. So motor function related to the thalamus is associated with the ventral and the anterior and the lateral nuclei of the thalamus. The thalamus also is associated with mood modification through the anterior and medial nuclei. And this is directly related and connected to the limbic system, because when we talk about the limbic system, you will hear me say it's all about mood, basically, your general mental status, emotions. Emotion regulation related to the thalamus is handled by the lateral dorsal nuclei, and sensory integration is through the lateral posterior and pulvinar nuclei. I wouldn't worry so much about what is on this slide outside of that the thalamus is surrounded by the 3rd ventricle, and it's associated with this type of sensory information. The subthalamus is the small area immediately inferior to the thalamus. You're not going to have to identify where the subthalamus is, but it helps to control motor function. So there's various parts of the brain that help to control motor function, and the subthalamus is one of them. Epithalamus, if you know anything about the epithalamus other than being part of the diencephalon, make sure that you know that the pineal gland is part of the epithalamus, and the pineal gland is associated with the sleep-wake cycle and other biorhythms. The hypothalamus is the most inferior portion of the diencephalon. When you're looking at the brain, it kind of, let me just pop over here to this picture. It kind of looked like, to me, this looks like a seahorse, looks like the top of a seahorse, and this looks like the head and the nose. The hypothalamus is actually this area here, which would be the nose. So again, most inferior portion of the diencephalon, part of the hypothalamus is something referred to as the mammillary bodies. And these are little bulges on the ventral surface of the hypothalamus. This helps control olfactory reflexes. Well, it's associated with olfactory reflexes and emotional responses to odors. So olfactory meaning sense of smell. The infundibulum hangs down from the bottom of the hypothalamus, and that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So that is like the main connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And we will talk about this a little bit more in the endocrine system. So infundibulum, it's important to remember that it is a little kind of stalk or piece extending from the floor of the hypothalamus, connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, and controls, the hypothalamus is basically the master of the endocrine system, but that is the direct link to the endocrine system that is in the brain. So the hypothalamus receives input from viscera, which are organs of the trunk, taste receptors, the limbic system, the nipples, external genitalia, and the prefrontal cortex. So the hypothalamus is pretty important based on all the information that it receives. The hypothalamus is important in regard to regulation of mood, emotion, sexual pleasure, satiation, which is hunger, rage, and fear. All right, so we are going to stop here and pick up on the cerebrum.